Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fashion culture series panel, Black Designers in American Fashion, from Enslaved Makers to Paris Couture. I'm joined here by our three panelists, Katie Knowles, Kristen Stewart, and Darnell Jamal Lisby. I'm going to give them each a quick introduction, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book that they all contributed to, and then I'll let each of them talk a little bit about their chapters. Katie Knowles holds a PhD in history from Rice University. She has 14 years of museum, curatorial, and collections experience, including doing work for the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Avenir Museum of Design and Merchandising at Colorado State University, Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, and the Bayou Bend Collection and Gardens of the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Kristen E Stewart is the Natalie L. Kloss Curator of Costume and Textiles at the Valentine, the Museum of the History of Richmond, Virginia, USA. Her research interests focus on the intersection of establishing gender identity norms within dress and the fashion industry. She's explored these themes in recent exhibitions at the Valentine, including The Virginia Man, Respect, Responsibility, and Rebellion, 2016 to 2017, and Pretty Powerful, Fashion and Virginia Women, 2018 to 2019. Darnell Jamal Lisby is a fashion historian and independent curator whose recent work includes his assistance in the curation of the Willie Smith Street Couture exhibition at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, in addition to consistently lending his voice to digital projects and curatorial efforts at various museums in New York and abroad. He contributes to mainstream and academic publications such as Teen Vogue, Cultured Magazine, and the Fashion Race Database. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project that we all worked on. It is a book called Black Designers in American Fashion, and I was very, very lucky to edit this volume with a number of really talented scholars, including the three that I have with me today. And so this is a book that looks at the impact of Black designers in American fashion, and it's split into 4 sections. So the first was Anonymous Histories, that looked at enslaved makers from the 18th century to the 19th century and early 20th. The second section is called In the Atelier, Modistes and Independent Designers. We have Into the Mainstream, 7th Avenue and Beyond. And then our last section is The Star Designer, National and International Impact. So each of our speakers is going to talk about one of our first 3 sections. And we're going to get started with just a small overview of what we look at in the overall book. So here you see some images that we included, including this dress made by enslaved makers and this really beautiful ornate velvet coat that was made by a woman in Boston who had been enslaved and then took those skills into her free life and created this beautiful fashions for herself. Some of our other chapters look at Ruby Bailey, who was a designer and an artist in New York City. Art Smith, who was a beautiful jeweler, and you can see these really kind of modern pieces that he created. And then we also had a chapter on Dapper Dan that really touches on the influence of hip hop fashion, not just in American fashion, but internationally. So you see that the book runs a very large gamut. But we're going to get started right now with Katie, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about her chapter.
Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here with everybody. This was such an interesting project to work on with all of you, and I'm so glad for Liz for bringing all of this work together. My chapter talked about enslaved people and their role within the American fashion system in the early part of the kind of development of what is an American fashion system, and really looking at the years leading up to the Civil War, the kind of decades right before that, when we start to see a lot more ready-made clothing and the turning point, the kind of shift from old ways of making and consuming clothing and textiles from being this very small scale production, a lot of knowledge held by the people who made and wore their own clothing, or who had very kind of intimate relationships with the people who were making it for them, into our kind of modern system where we don't often know who those people are. We don't have a lot of knowledge within our own minds about how our clothing is made. And looking at how enslaved people were really the fashion leaders in terms of this shift in how we have this relationship to our clothes. And that's really embodied here in these 2 coats, which are from the Historic New Orleans collection. They date from the late 1850s, early 1860s, so right at the period of the last years of legal slavery here in the United States. And they were purchased by a man named William Mercer, who was one of the wealthiest people in the entire country at the time. He enslaved several hundred people on multiple plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi, and was also heavily involved in banking and finance. And he purchased these coats in New York City from Brooks Brothers. One of them has a label from Brooks Brothers in it. And they're both very similarly made. And these are early examples of men's tailored ready made clothing. So these would have been worn by men who were like personal servants to him that were enslaved, that would have been working in the home, and really signify his power as a wealthy plantation owner and enslaver. But also in the chapter, I talk about how people who were enslaved in this kind of space where they were around a lot of white people, they had actually a lot of power within the slavery system over other enslaved people, and how they could use this clothing and understand this clothing in other ways. From what it was intended to do, which was to make them feel oppressed and like they were not their own selves. If you want to go to the next slide, talking about, rather than people who are wearing clothing, also people who are making clothing and textiles, and using these samples of fabric that are in the American Civil War Museum collection. These used to be part of the Confederate Museum collection, which is now part of the American Civil War Museum. And so they were initially collected as this example of home production and patriotism for the Confederacy during the American Civil War. But I talk about them in the chapter and thinking about the knowledge and the intellectual contributions to textiles and clothing that enslaved people had, because these are identified in the record as having been made by an unidentified and unnamed enslaved woman or women. And the skills that were required to make textiles like this on a small farm or a plantation in the middle of the 1860s, when we have most people switching over to this new way of consuming textiles that they didn't make, that they were not really involved in. And yet here we have an example of the continuation of making knowledge, and how the women who made these textiles continued to practice that, and how it was a way for them to provide customized clothing for themselves and for the people in their community, in a system that was increasingly becoming more and more about uniformity and a lack of individualization within clothing from the mass production of textiles.
That's so interesting. And one of the fascinating things I found about this chapter was how far back this fast fashion, this industrialized systems go. We generally don't think of it going back that far, and how enslaved people were really kind of enmeshed in that system. Kristen is going to tell us a little bit about kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, very, very high end, very custom clothing.
Hi, thank you, Liz. This chapter, I hope, contributes to a large body of yet unfinished work that traces the life of Fanny Chris Payne White, a Black Virginian who was born free just as the Civil War ended, to formerly enslaved parents in Cumberland County, Virginia, who in one lifetime achieved renown as the leading modiste of the segregated city of Richmond, where her clients included the most prominent white women of the state capital, and who, as Jim Crow era Virginia adopted more and more discriminatory legislation that limited the rights and access of its Black citizens. By the way, this is the moment when all of the monuments that have now come down went up. She used her prosperity and her social connections to leave, to move with her talent and her second husband, who was successful in his own right in the restaurant industry, to New York, where they were members of the smart class of successful creative professionals. So the chapter focuses on Fanny Chris's time in Richmond, where she built the business and the reputation that really opened up her world. She did not advertise, and so my research relied on snippets of oral history and museum records, city directories, federal census, and the tangential evidence of her success in real estate records and Black society columns. And of course, on the dresses The Valentine is lucky to have 4 dresses that we know were designed by Fanny Criss, probably more. An analysis of each of these in the chapter clearly demonstrates that her success was founded in her exquisite talent in both the design and the technical execution of turn-of-the-century women's fashion. And in fact, Katie, I felt a little thrill reading your chapter and thinking about how Fanny Criss's excellence in the exacting creation of haute couture quality confronted the imposition of fast fashion on enslaved peoples and maybe even her own parents. Fanny Criss was born sometime between 1865 and 1867. She was the free-born child of formerly enslaved Cumberland County farmers, Samuel and Adeline Criss. Federal and state documentation of formerly enslaved Virginians are at best inconsistent, and especially during the Reconstruction. And it's not surprising that the records of really a country girl are difficult to trace until her 1895 marriage in Richmond, Virginia, to William Thornton Payne. But from that time, she starts to make a remarkable public mark, not through marketing, but through documented evidence of her success. In labels, as you can see here, on stylish and sophisticated turn-of-the-century gowns, in the federal census, city directories, that originally stated her profession as dressmaker, but as she kept up with the times and as the term evolved, she elected to adopt modiste to describe her work. In published real estate transactions that tracked her ownership of city properties, and you can change the slide here so we can see her gorgeous home on the left. It's actually to the left of the white porch. But this home was adjacent to Maggie Lena Walker's home, who was the most prominent Black businesswoman in Richmond, who chartered a bank, owned a department store, owned a newspaper, owned an insurance company, who really ran the town in Jackson Ward, which was the most elite Black community in Richmond, in Richmond's segregated neighborhood. So Fanny Criss Payne bought this home under her own name, not under the name of her husband's, and she also bought at least one other property that she rented out not far from this property. Her life was also documented in Black newspapers and magazines that celebrated her success. One little gem was, for me, was a portrait of her success in The Voice of the Negro magazine in 1904 that positioned her as the top dressmaker in Richmond, regardless of class, and listed really all of her financial success, listed her property, listed how much she'd spent decorating her home. I mean, really trumpeted her as not only a leading business professional, but also as a woman, a superstar, right? As a superstar. Her life was, and her life was documented in newspapers that celebrated her travel as a woman who visits New York, and when she moved to New York, who visits Richmond, who summers in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. These were deemed notable acts in society columns. And of course, we'll have another slide change. Her dresses help to ground her success. We understand when we take the 4 pieces that we have together, we can begin to see some hallmarks that define her work: a sophisticated opulence that is achieved with a balanced mix of texture and plain materials. So if a dress is highly textured, it's broken up with clean lines. If textured is very clean, it's balanced with ornamental elements. She has a precise finishing, and I think the most consistent hallmark is an integration of construction and ornamentation that turns shaping elements like gores and godets into ornament, and slide again, ornamental elements like pin tucks into style lines. And I'd like to mention one piece of evidence of the remarkable generational impact of her success that is not in the chapter. When Fanny Criss's father, Samuel Criss, died in 1932, she commissioned a sizable few inches in the New York Amsterdam newspaper to honor her formerly enslaved father, who was a successful Cumberland County farmer. He was a patriarch of a large Virginia family, and she wrote an obituary that included his photo. This is expensive, and the respect he deserved. So even without printed self-promotion, Criss managed to create a remarkable public record of a woman who used her skills as a dressmaker to run a lucrative business, to train a skilled staff of young Black women, to travel for business to New York's Fashion Center, to purchase multiple properties in an exclusive neighborhood, and ultimately to leave the Jim Crow era city for Harlem at the start of the Renaissance. And Darnell Jamal learning about Jay Jackson's departure for Paris, I felt echoes of Fanny Chris's own brave determination to work in an environment where she could succeed unencumbered by intolerance. So I will move. With that, I'll move it on to you.
And this is such a great, Fanny Chris is such an amazing kind of representation of success at this time period. And, Pierre Moss just had this amazing couture show. And I really feel like that kind of bridges, he was at Madame C.J. Walker's mansion. She was a contemporary of Fanny Chris. They lived on the same street. But of course, he's doing Paris couture. And so Darnell's going to tell us a little bit about Parisian couturiers, namely Jay Jackson.
Absolutely, and I think that was like I felt the same. I feel the same way in terms of that relationship of Fanny Chris and Jay Jackson, because and also before I even get into it, just a side note, of course, that there was that WWD article that Rachel Henderson was a part of, and I also want to celebrate her research on Jay Jackson as well. And she did a exhibition that was at the Queen's Library, I believe, a few years ago, and then it went. I forgot where it went afterwards, but neither here nor there. But I know that she'll probably continue showing Jay Jackson's work, but that certainly was echoed a lot of the research that I delved into about Jay Jackson's life as the first Black African American couturier in Paris, really. And also there was Highland Booker at the time, because I know that there's, I'm trying to cover all the bases because I don't want people to come from my neck.
First is always complicated. It's always complicated to say the first. But.
Right. First is such a tricky word. I personally like to stay away from the word first. But there was Highland Booker when Charles Frederick Worth was trying to, the house was trying to revive itself, but it was, I believe, still based in London and didn't resurface back in Paris. But with that said, Jay Jackson's ascendancy as the head of Jean-Louis Charest, only for a short time, definitely kind of gave him that title. But before that, as you see here, he went to Paris in 1967, but he started his design career a little bit before then. He went to NYU to pursue like a costume design degree specifically. Actually, no, he was in NYU going for finance and business. And then he was doing, he designed a dress or costume for a young lady that he was, seeing at the time, and people were marveled at her dress, her outfit ensemble, and that really inspired him to move into costume design, which then he eventually transitioned as his core degree program. And from there, he began to make a lot of relationships along 7th Avenue, and he was among many of the Black designers that were really kind of becoming more prominent in the late 60s into the 70s. I.e. Stephen Burroughs or Willie Smith and Jeffrey Banks, who came a little bit later on, but certainly in that niche of the late 60s into the early 70s, you see that rise of Black male designers really becoming a lot more prominent. And Jay Jackson at the time, he was experimenting, you can see a lot with what he was doing. And in 1967, as you can see with this dress here, he wanted to create clothing that was, of course, of that refined measure that was seen in that ready to wear in that Paris model. But he also wanted to make sure that there was a tinge of accessibility. And you really see this evolution within his aesthetic as he moved to Paris and then eventually back into the United States. If you see actually on the next slide, I believe, here is a silk satin twill kimono. So Jay Jackson, like many of his contemporaries, even beyond his Black male peers, they were looking at a more global approach toward design, looking at different intersections, cultural intersections as inspiration. And certainly, obviously, as most people know, the kimono is very much in the Japanese tradition. But with that said, the world was becoming a lot smaller, and culture exchange was becoming a lot more the norm, specifically in 7th Avenue as the American fashion industry was formalizing even more. when he went to Paris, which was around 1967-68, he began to work, I believe, for Yves Saint Laurent as a mentee. And from there, he went to Jean-Louis Cheret, and he worked as a designer, as a lead designer. And at the time, the backers of the Jean-Louis Cheret house were in conflict with Jean-Louis Cheret himself. And Jean-Louis eventually left to fight, legally fight for control of his business. And during that time, the backers put Jay Jackson in control of the entire house. And from 1969 to about 1970, Jean-Louis Cheret couture collections were designed by Jay Jackson, giving him that space to really kind of show that Blackness can really kind of exist in Paris fashion in a way that hadn't really been seen before, in a physical manifestation as well as a more design manifestation. Eventually, the backers lost the legal fight, and Jean-Louis Cheret reinstated himself as head of the business. And afterwards, Jay Jackson began to work for Givenchy, a handful of left bank boutiques. But he was still pretty prominent. Well, not only say prominent in the sense of, Yves Saint Laurent, but his name was still very much resonating in the Paris fashion scene. And a lot of his designs did make it to the United States of America. And as you can see in my bibliography and press, across the United States, they were actually showing a lot of Jay Jackson's designs for various boutiques, left bank boutiques. In 1973, he came back to the United States. And from there, I'm not sure if we put the next slide in. Yes, and in 1973, he began to figure out what was next for him. And he wanted to really kind of bring Paris style back to the United States, what he learned from all of these great legends that we herald today, and really reinterpret that into accessible fashions that was obviously very much in the norm in the 1970s. And of course, still that cultural exchange that was happening that he wanted to continue to maintain. He worked for Benson and Partners first, which was a 7th Avenue manufacturing company for a few years. And then he went to Pierre Cardin, New York, which was the licensing line for Pierre Cardin Paris. And here in this very famous Essence magazine, it was an editorial where they featured all of the leading Black designers of the 1970s. At that point, Jay Jackson was featured, and here you can see his designs for Pierre Cardin, New York, which included jodhpurs, which is from India, out of Indian inspiration. And you see the cape, which was very much out of more Latin American and Southern American inspiration. So he was bringing all of these different kind of aspects of his worldly travels into this one entire ensemble. But with that said, Jay Jackson continued his design career up until about the 1980s, and then he transitioned into costume designing from Motown, costume design for the Motown 25th anniversary, as well as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. So with that said, Jay Jackson certainly had a storied career. But with that said, I hope that his story continues to get out there, so that we're able to credit this lineage of Blackness that has taken over the fashion industry in a very incredible way.
Jay Jackson is such an important figure because we think today about Virgil Abloh or even Rihanna and Black American people taking their own aesthetics, which I think are very American in a lot of ways, into Paris. And so you have this exchange where he was taking Paris aesthetics into the United States, but finding a way to kind of make them work in the fashion industry. So I think a really important figure to think about where fashion is right now. So I just want to ask you guys all a couple of questions. And the first is, what does your narrative about these specific fashion makers, fashion designers, tell us about their contemporary worlds, both inside and outside the fashion industry? Katie, why don't we start with you? We'll go chronologically.
Yeah, I think that this, I really was talking in my chapter about a lot of different people. It's very unique to find an example of an enslaved person where you can kind of build a a biography out of their whole life, because we just don't have as much information about a single person in the historical record. It's not to say that there aren't people like that, whose stories that we could do that with. It just wasn't in my chapter. And so I was really talking about their contemporary world and kind of how they were leaders within that world in a way that I don't think we've really recognized, in terms of this shift in the fashion system, and talking about the fashion as a system that is, it's a social system, it's a political system, it's an economic system. It affects all of these parts of our lives. And the place of enslaved people in the 19th century within that world, really, we only have gotten to a point of finally recognizing that their labor on plantations, on cotton plantations in the American South, is, of course, a key contribution to making this shift possible. That the capitalist nature of those plantation systems in the 19th century, and even in the early or the late 18th century, is where we get the ability to produce things at this much more faster rate, on the shift to kind of thinking about wearing clothing and discarding it instead of wearing it and keeping it and caring for it. And so I think that's where I wanted to take it to the next step of saying, okay, well, yes, that is an important contribution, but beyond that, we also have people that they're the ones wearing these clothes at first, where a lot of wealthier people, middle class people, they're still wearing custom clothing, small scale production, the higher quality stuff that's not the cotton that's mostly being grown, but these lower grades on the southern plantations in the US South. Those aren't the people who are the target consumers of these textiles. The target consumers are the enslaved people. And so thinking about what that experience is, that kind of embodied experience of wearing those clothes on your body, how they are used by larger society to try and to continue to oppress enslaved people, by kind of making them not fashionable, and yet they are, in fact, contributing to this new fashion revolution, both through the production of the raw cotton on the plantations, and then also figuring out how do we wear and use these new kinds of textiles, these new kinds of clothing, and how we're making them. And at the same time, finding moments of what I would call resistance to that by redefining what that is, how those clothes are being worn by these people that are not custom made for their bodies. And also in the example of something like continued home production and home dyeing, and the knowledge and kind of keeping and carrying on that knowledge across the generations that we see with the example of the textile fragments from the 1860s. And I have a quote in the chapter from a Works Progress Administration interview with a woman named Emma Tidwell, who describes in detailed steps how to dye with natural indigo. And to me, that just it goes back in time and it goes forward in time, and it's this kind of situated within her contemporary moment in her lifetime, and yet also she's thinking back to her ancestors and also looking forward, because when she's interviewed, it's the 1930s, and she's remembering her childhood in slavery. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about how we're looking at fashion history and the contributions of African American people and the permeability of past, present, and future that I think is very much a part of Black designers' aesthetic, that I see as a kind of commonality of speaking to each other across time, and yet also being situated in your moment.
Absolutely. And your chapter is one of the earliest ones, and it really helps lay a foundation for the rest of the book. Kristen, you talked a bit about kind of the Jim Crow South and Reconstruction in the way Fanny Chris's contemporary world, but do you want to expand on that?
Really just her experience brought home the impact of post-Reconstruction legislation, crafting segregationist policies. And really, it begins rolling at the turn of the 20th century. This reaction begins rolling in full as a legislative effort, And I mean, obviously it starts before that, but we see this crescendo at the turn of the 20th century. And it is directly impacting the life of a successful creative. You know, in 1911, really when she's probably at her peak in Richmond, in April, the Richmond City Council adopted a residential segregation ordinance. And so, and also during this period, legislation is adopted that prevents any Black community members from riding Richmond's streetcar who are not accompanying a white child or assisting a white family. And so essentially what that does is make it possible for Black community members to succeed in service jobs, but not in any other industry, not in the creative industries, not in the professional classes. And so Richmond lost one of its most extraordinary creatives. I mean, you know, Richmond suffered as a result of its own blindness, I would say, of its own segregationist tendencies. And just sort of, you know, reading her own progress alongside these annual new discriminatory legislations really brings home the conditions in which she is charting her own path to success.
I love that you talk about this in your chapter because it shows you, first of all, how insidious and precise these Jim Crow laws were, but also how, like, you know, fashion is a really interesting, really informative lens to think about this. You know, when you think about it through one person's life, one person's business, one person's creative practice, I think it really helps bring home these ideas that can seem really large and overwhelming.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it intersects, actually, I would say, with how Fanny Chris with the ways in which her career reflects and impacts the fashion industry outside of Richmond at the time. I mean, the fact that she was so celebrated, right? Fashion is already a spectator sport. It's just a few years before Poiret's parties are in every magazine, not just fashion magazines, right? And she's participating in that spectator sport. And she's reported on as a woman in the know, a woman who is part of society, part of her society, not just supporting her society. At the same time that she is somehow the white community is able to, like, she can live in this liminal space where she's a society member in one community and a supporter of the society community in another, or of the society in another community, until frankly she is fed up with it, with that liminal space. I mean, yeah.
It's such an interesting lens to think about that time period. Darnell, tell us how you think your work on Jay Jackson and his career in fashion, what does it tell us about his contemporary world? And I feel like he has so many connections to how the fashion industry was run at that time.
Well, it's interesting. And back to even to Katie's point about, you know, how there is this inclination of creatives working to connect, you know, a lineage, you know, and connect really time and build upon each other's work essentially, but also kind of reflecting their own time. This is something that I didn't have any personal connection to Jay Jackson or his family. I know Rachel Henderson has, which I think is so incredible. But I will say from my work on Willie Smith as well, and also talking to Stephen and Jeffrey, very much all in the same boat, for lack of better terms. There is this attitude of, you know, using fashion to escape, you know, because most of them were children of the civil rights movement. You know, they were children that, you know, whose parents were, you know, certainly either, you know, on the end of oppression in very direct ways, or they were children like Beth Ann's parents were, you know, actively, you know, they were activists. So like they were very much all wrapped up into that. So they wanted to really kind of, in my opinion, use fashion as a way to kind of sidestep a little bit of those experiences and and really kind of push forward for this narrative of like, even though, yes, we're Black, we can still design just as great as the best of them. and don't look at me for who I am, like what genetic gene pool I come from. Look at me and in merit, what I can create, what I can produce to bring people across the world. Because even a lot of times, a lot of Jackson and his peers, they weren't really the face of their brands. They promoted the work. It was a few of them that decided to really kind of go out and be the more celebrity type. But for the most part, Jackson and a lot of his peers were still in that old school way of fashion of the designers really kind of back in the workroom, let the work kind of speak for itself. And so, and a lot of that also obviously is probably still wrapped up in racism. And I think that that's something that's just the reality of fashion as a capitalist system in the world that we live. It's built on colonialization. Well, it's derived through colonialization. So it's just wrapped up into all of these different contingencies. And that's just how history has been built. But with that said, I think for Jay Jackson, the narrative around him was really kind of creating fashion that that didn't have a race to it, didn't have a person or a specific group attached to it. It was for everyone. It was for, whether you're wealthy or whether you're broke, it was for everyone, no matter what side of the railroad tracks you were living. And so, he worked in really all levels of the fashion industry, from couture, bridge line, ready to wear. So he had experience, a larger experience than many peers, black or white, at the time. So I think that should also be kind of illuminated as well. And so, but at the same time, the reality was he wasn't appreciated. So I think that, despite being, so prolific in his work. And so I think that was also the other cautionary tale that, many of these Black designers had to kind of go through that, so that a Kirby, a Virgil, a Rihanna, all of these designers today can get that acclaim that is actually deserved. So.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We could talk forever about how these different designers all kind of build into this one story that really tells the story of American fashion, not just Black American fashion, but the American fashion system, and how it influenced international fashion as well as the way people dress in this country. But I want to thank all of you for joining me today, and for contributing your work to this volume. I was a privilege for me to edit it, but also it was so important to put it out there in the world for scholars, for people who are interested, for students. Really great works. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Liz.